Hey there, folks. Today, I want to more or less burst a few bubbles that have been floating around the internet world for quite a while about Toyotas. The vehicle that you have in front of you right now is a 2000 Toyota Celica GT-S. It's the very last of the sports cars that Toyota sold in the 20th century. And it's kind of not exactly what people think it is. A lot of folks like to glorify the engine on it and say, this is one of the most peaky and aggressive engines fitted into a vehicle that truly is an all-out sports car. And in practice, that's really not true at all. This is, for the practical purposes of daily driving from that time period, a personal sporty coupe, a touring coupe almost. Maybe not as big as a full-size Toyota Supra, but more or less designed for the same purpose. I can give you a lot of specs about, okay, yes, it has 190 horsepower, and yes, it's a 7th generation, but there's an even bigger story behind what made this Celica a period piece that appealed to a very specific audience. And it's an audience that most people aren't even aware of, that actually changed Toyota forever. Way back in the mid-1980s, there was a huge number of young people in their teenage years, 20s and 30s, who lived in the Northeast. And they would actually go on to a lot of the colleges out there that had a liberal arts orientation to them, and a few were pre-professional factories as well. But these folks had several things in common. First of all, they were all upper middle class. They were predominantly ones that would become highly educated, many first generation, and even then there was a difference in the way they were educated when it came to cars. It used to be, until right around the mid-1980s, that the Ford Mustang and the Chevy Camaro were marketed as the dream cars for a younger audience. That changed right around the early to mid-1980s. And part of it was due to a model called the Toyota Celica Supra that wasn't technically a Supra quite yet. It was a Celica that more or less had all the options on it and a better powertrain. It was kind of like I guess the best way of saying it, it was almost like having two models within, obviously, the same name. And they weren't cheap at all. A Celica Supra, even in the early 1980s, 82, 83, 84, was right around $15,000 if you ordered one, with a stick shift and the cloth interior, not even the leather interior. And they did well in the marketplace, but not overwhelmingly well. What really helped Toyota and Honda during this period of time was the ability to take a sporty coupe, give it a bit of a flagship, just like that Toyota Celica Supra, and give, kind of lower end versions that would still have most of the sporty aura to it, make that, and characteristics. They would, throw a spoiler here. They would make the interior more like a cockpit than just a plain Jane sporty coupe. And they would actually, overall, the quality of the materials were oftentimes 2 clicks better than anything else in the class. This one over here is 21 years old, and the only major defect I have to deal with is this rip on the driver's seat bottom. And that will only take a couple $100 to make right. It's remarkably well preserved. It has about 101,000 miles, so it's not necessarily a cream puff, but most vehicles from this time period, by the time they reach 20 years, they were in the junkyard. There was no survival with them. But for the Celicas and the Preludes, and later on the Nissan 240s, these vehicles actually wore very well. And that population I told you about, they listened very strongly to Consumer Reports or Car and Driver, all these publications that were very pro Toyota, Honda, Nissan. And as a result of that, this vehicle over here is kind of like when these people wanted to become doctors, lawyers, professors, accountants, investment bankers. This was seen as one of the optimal vehicles for what would become their 20s to maybe early 30s car. Maybe a little bit even older than that. But this was generally a car that was aimed for people who were under 40 and were willing to pay more money, and I mean thousands of dollars more money, to have a Japanese sporty coupe instead of an American sports car. There's also a couple other unique features about these vehicles that most people don't realize. The first is that it's nice to think that almost everybody chose a stick shift option back in the day, but a lot of these people had to do metropolitan commutes. They had to go from what they would either be the city in the beginning to another location in the city to work at, or they would go from the suburbs to a city. I grew up in an area that was 5 miles away from the Bronx, and I gotta tell you, I don't know a single person I grew up with, and this was during the late 80s, early 90s, I don't know a single person who actually chose to have a stick shift vehicle. Even those that were enthusiasts knew that they would have to suffer through commuting in the New York tri-state area. And back then, the New York tri-state area had about 30 million people. And the costs involved and the 1 hour plus commute times, they were pretty brutal. So when you got a vehicle, you wanted to have something that could handle it. And on a deeper level, though, you still wanted to be able to shift your own gears sometimes. And these had a nice little sport mode that would allow you to do exactly that. The only trouble was that when these vehicles first started up, and we're going to go ahead and just take this quickly down the road over here, I'll show you exactly what I mean. Hear that? Hear that there's no shift to third until a little bit later on? These vehicles, when they were cold, were kind of, they didn't grab the overdrive gears and the higher gears as quickly as they did otherwise. And you may think, you know, I kind of want that. You know, I want to have the higher RPMs when I drive. Well, sometimes you do, and sometimes when you're getting ready for an hour-long commute, playing follow the leader with another vehicle in front of you driving no more than 20 to 30 miles an hour, you want something that will actually stay in the lower ranges. And unfortunately, you know, you could, once it warms up, obviously you could always do it, but people who had these vehicles kind of had a bit of a dual personality with them. On one side, they wanted to have something sporty, fun, and something to be seen with. You know, this vehicle has a nice, really, really gorgeous inside. And the outside is no slouch either. But these buyers would also not really want to have the sports car experience all the time. They didn't want to necessarily have to deal with constant high RPMs, constant shifting. And so as a result of that, and also as a result of the fact that because they live near metropolitan areas, most of these people didn't even know how to drive a stick. Over 80% of these vehicles that were sold had automatic transmissions to them. And they weren't cheap. The average Celica GT-S, like this one, was already well into the mid to high 20s. And in 2021 money, you're looking at a vehicle that would be around early to mid 40s price-wise. Which, when you think about it, a sporty two-door hatchback that is a 2+2, you're really not going to put too many people in that back seat, and they're generally not going to be happy if they are stuck in the back seat for a long time. By the time 2000 came around, it was almost as if the Celica was a model that was designed to die in that generation because the demographics of it had changed so much. There had been a time, you know, back in the mid 80s to late 80s, early 90s, when a four-door model wasn't really appealing. It didn't have the nice curves to it. They were more or less created as these almost a block styling to them. There was almost no aerodynamics. The first four-door that really had decent aerodynamic looks to it was the Audi 5000 back around 82, 83. And that particular model ended up in a terrible fate due to the fact that they were blamed for an unintended acceleration defect that eventually pretty much submarined that vehicle. But then there was the Ford Taurus and Mercury Sable from the mid 80s. But again, you look at one of those, and you look at, if you go in history, you'll see that the Celicas were way sportier than that. Way, in my opinion, way nicer looking for somebody who was young to early middle aged. The Sables and the Tauruses were, you know, with the exception of the SHOs, they were family vehicles. This over here screamed anything but a family. And it was kind of like a situation where you want to be able to follow, and this is a big thing in the car business, you want to be able to keep a demographic as long as you possibly can, as long as there's money involved. And you can look at the history of Cadillac during the 1990s. You can see vehicles sold by Buick and Oldsmobile. They carried the same people literally to their coffins. And the Celica ended up being a different answer, a different outcome. They followed these people until they eventually bought Camrys and Accords. And a few of them bought, you know, a Lexus or an Acura. But these buyers would always stay very close to the Toyota and Honda orbit. Because unlike Cadillac and Buick, they were able to follow a demographic, a group of buyers to their next stage. You know, unfortunately, those folks, after they had the Cadillac and the Buick, you know, they had lived their life on this planet. The Toyota buyer, they were oftentimes able to buy another Toyota or a Honda, another Toyota or a Honda. If they wanted to be risky with their money, even slightly risky in that Consumer Reports avoid risk, avoid low reliability type of way, they would get a Nissan or maybe a Subaru. But a car like this was so high in quality, just 2 clicks above anything else being sold at that time in this particular sport niche, that whoever bought this type of vehicle, they would almost always be very loyal and very satisfied with the Toyota brand. And by the time the mid-2000s came along, nearly all these people were already going to be going towards the Camrys, and, you know, if they didn't want to spend as much money, the Corollas, the Civics, the Accords. And it was kind of, in my way, a mournful reality that Toyota eventually had to create the Scion sub-brand, because I frankly think that if they had a Scion Celica and a Scion Supra, I think that sub-brand could have been a lot more successful versus having a Scion TC and a Scion IQ and a Scion XA and XB. The Celica was already a proven model. It was already, by the time the Scion came out, it was nearly, the Celica name was over 35 years old. And the Supra name was synonymous with the best Toyota sports car ever made. So I kind of wonder sometimes, why did they even bother with creating these acronyms and these alphanumerics that really didn't mean anything, while they already had the right names to give to what would be the successor of those models. Well, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening, and God bless.